Science is a living body of information that's not static, it's not fixed. It's designed to be constantly updated when new discoveries come to light.
One of the things that's echoed in the ancient stories around the world, whether it's Plato talking about Atlantis, or the ancient Egyptians in the Temple of Sais, is that we find that they discuss how the civilizations have been destroyed from periods of great flooding, but also extreme heat and fire. It's about a totality of all of these different catastrophic events that have led to the disappearance and destruction of these pre-Diluvian civilizations.
There are petroglyphs all over the world with the same exact shapes telling us that this was a worldwide plasma event that was documented and recorded by countless cultures, including the people of Easter Island in their Rongo Rongo script.
There's no cultural memory in humanity of how they made these megalithic structures. There's no recollection of the engineering technology that's required to create these structures because it wasn't their technology. It was the gods' technology. That's why we can't do it again.
We're writing a new story right now. We have to, because the evidence no longer supports the story of the past. This is where our new story begins.
What really prompted me on this search for Atlantis was starting with the evidence of it, the physical evidence.
We forget it's not just about a lost continent of mythological proportions. It's about us.
These Atlanteans were human-divine hybrids. They had a physical body, but they also possessed divine, highly spiritual souls. If we only stick to the literal interpretation, we're never gonna really get to the core of the esoteric meaning of the spiritual truths that these people try to communicate to us. Yeah, it's a sort of catastrophobia. That's
yes, catastrophobia.
I do believe that the pyramid might originally have had some functional purpose.
Which of the places you've been to blew your mind and was far more than you ever expected when you went there? Atlantis has captured the modern imagination for millennia now, beginning with accounts from Plato. Today, far more evidence for this lost civilization is available than back then. When placed alongside esoteric accounts, we begin to piece together what life on that magnificent continent may have been like. Toward that end, Marco Vigato has dedicated 15 years to documenting the evidence, and he's here with us today. And welcome, Marco.
Thank you very much, Regina.
It's the first time we've met. Yeah, this is wonderful.
It's a pleasure being here.
Thank you. What's wonderful about what you've done here with your book, you're a very good writer, wonderful research, amazing pictures. You have put your body all over the world in search of this story. But you also do put together some of the esoteric elements of it.
Yeah, I think there are always two sides to the Atlantis story. On the one hand, you have the scientific Atlantis, the search for physical evidence of Atlantis, but then on the other hand, you also have the esoteric Atlantis, that of the esoteric tradition. And for me, these two sides, they will always coexisted, like living next to each other. What really prompted me on this search for Atlantis was starting with the evidence of it, the physical evidence, visiting, as you say, hundreds of archaeological sites around the world. I started getting the picture that the way we're told history, the evolution of civilization was fundamentally flawed. There was a missing episode in our past, in our history. And that's how we made the connection with these esoteric traditions of Atlantis. I really came to the conclusion that Atlantis was really the missing piece that could make sense of all these inexplicable, unexplained structures and advanced science that you find in ancient times at these archaeological sites.
And similar symbolism, similar artwork, but in parts of the world that theoretically had no connection with one another at the time, but in fact, all had a connection with one big item sitting right in the midst of all of these different continents and also cultures. And it's true, everyone was left scratching their head. How did that thing in the Yucatan end up with the exact same symbol we saw on that piece in Ireland, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Atlantis is the piece.
Absolutely,
the missing
absolutely.
piece.
I think this is something that is largely missing in our modern scientific worldview. I think there is a strong push towards specialization. We have specialists in so many different fields, which it's a great thing in many aspects. But in a field like the study of our past, of our history, I think one needs to also piece together all these different pieces. One needs to take a much more holistic view, because otherwise one runs the risk of not seeing the forest.
To me, the story of our past, because it's about us, we forget it's not just about a lost continent of mythological proportions. It's about us. That's where the story's getting interesting, and you and I are going to have a story taking both of these elements into account. Let's begin the story with the peopling. Let's assume that Atlantis existed, and is now under the sea. You have maps of what happened during the various phases of Atlantis and up through its final destruction. And in these maps, you'll see how far north Atlantis reached. To me, what's always been curious about that was the nature of the beings or humans that occupied that land at that time. It was a very different reality. So explain to us your understanding into the Hyperborean story as well of the people that were incarnating to that continent, the upper part of that continent in particular, the northern parts.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, you have to think about Atlantis as a huge continental landmass that stretched across much of the Atlantic Ocean, particularly in the North Atlantic Ocean. So it would have had a very broad variety of climates and ethnicities as well, of different people that inhabited Atlantis. Now, something that is suggested both by the esoteric tradition as well as by some of the latest anthropological and scientific evidence is that modern humans, or what we consider as anatomically modern humans, may have first appeared on a now sunken mid-Atlantic landmass. So Atlantis is really, in a way, the place of origin of all of mankind. It's the first place on Earth where, if you believe in the accounts of the esoteric tradition, some higher spiritual beings incarnating by taking bodily form on Atlantis. And this is what also prompted the cycle of physical as well as mental and spiritual evolution of mankind, eventually giving rise to our modern humanity. So I really believe, and that's what it suggests in the book, that Atlantis was a true cradle of the human race, and from there humanity spread to all these other continents. The idea that some spiritual beings or entities incarnated on Earth, they took on bodily form.
Yes.
You can call these entities however you want, as advanced souls, multidimensional beings, but there is this very strong suggestion. This is something that we find since the earliest times. So even in Plato's account of Atlantis, he talks about this incarnation of a divine principle. So from the very beginning, these Atlanteans were sort of human-divine beings, human-divine hybrids in a way. They had a physical body, but they also possessed divine, highly spiritual souls. This is a key part of the Atlantis narrative.
Yes, a key part. I mean, that's a critical part for us today. We are the progeny of that.
Yes.
And this is what you call the conflicts we have inside that are called having a dual nature.
Yep.
You can really go right back to that time where that new kind of hybrid being was created of sorts.
And I think it's always a cyclical repetition in a way, in the same way as Plato suggests that the original Atlanteans were these semi-divine beings. They were still very much attached to their spiritual roots. Then what happened and what eventually led to Atlantis' downfall was a fall into matter, a fall into materialism, which is very similar to what is happening today to our own civilization, to our own society. We're losing sight of our spiritual origins. We're falling into these materialism, like the cult of science in a certain way. And that's probably one of the reasons, if not the main reasons, why the Atlantis story resonates so much with our modern audiences.
I agree with you. There's this deep curiosity we have. In fact, I think at Gaia, whenever they do research and kind of look at what people are interested in, Atlantis comes out almost number one most of the time. It's way at the top of our audience interest. Why is that, right? Well, perhaps it's because Many of the people who are watching that, many of the people who are researching and writing, were there in the day. If you look at that, where souls continue on their own cycles of learning and reincarnation and so forth, it would make sense that we'd have an intense curiosity about Atlantis, but also something else, an intense fear and propagation of the story of mass extinction.
Yeah, it's a sort of catastrophobia. That's
Yes,
a term
catastrophobia.
you should find. And I think, as we say, there are many different explanations for that. One possibility is that we still keep a sort of genetic memory in a way of these times. So it's part of us, as our ancestors, at least, they lived through all these events. And right now, because the circumstances, you can call them the cosmic cycles, or the point where we are in the path of human evolution, sort of mirrors the circumstances that existed back then. We're forced in a way to relive all of that, or that triggers an activation in a way of these genetic memories. On the other hand, there's also the very strong suggestion in many traditions that or a belief in reincarnation, that souls that lived at that time are reincarnating again today. So that makes me believe that in a way, our civilization were at the place, at the time in history when we are repeating many of the events that occurred in the Atlantean past.
Let's talk about the Hyperboreans, okay, and who they were, what the nature of the beings were.
Well, in the esoteric tradition, going back to theosophy, the Hyperboreans were considered to be the first human race, in a way. So, theosophy had this system, this very complex system of multiple different human races and sub-races. So
root races and
right. So the Hyperboreans were really the first. They were still a spiritual race, meaning they did not have a bodily form, a body necessarily. They would be identified as purely spiritual souls or multidimensional beings. And according to the esoteric tradition, they settled in a now lost northern land that was called Hyperborea. Now, this is particularly interesting also for the Atlantis story, because there is actually a possibility that this Hyperborea later became Atlantis, or was in a way a northern Atlantis, where this incarnation first took place, and then because of geological upheavals, that originally northern polar land was displaced towards the mid-Atlantic Ocean.
Yes. Taking that story forward, you had then an embodiment, as it was called, an embodiment into human form, what became the human being, the Homo sapien, Homo sapien sapien.
And you have to ask yourself the question why it happened at that specific time. Right? And I think the answer is because it was at that time that a bodily form became available for these spiritual beings to incarnate and take on that bodily form. So in a way, I think the theory of evolution, this idea that like our bodies, our like bodily form evolved throughout millions and millions of years is fundamentally correct. What these forgets, however, is the parallel process of spiritual evolution as well. What is it that really triggers civilization? What makes us human? It's not necessarily just our bodies, it's our mind, our soul as well. And this is what came from these, and according to the esoteric tradition, were essentially spiritual beings, multidimensional beings that guided, in a way, also the process of physical evolution.
Absolutely. What happened that you can understand from archaeological evidence that created the collapse of the first upper part of Atlantis?
Well, as you say, there were like spiritual root causes. It had to do with the fact that the primeval Atlanteans were dual beings. He had this spiritual and this physical component. So even Plato himself suggested that the cause of the decadence of Atlantis was a fall into materialism. In the end, the physical aspect of these beings took the upper hand, and this is
exactly
what caused ultimately their downfall. Now, from a more like archaeological and geophysical point of view, around that time we have the first Atlantean cataclysm. So we're talking about a time around 35,000 years ago. This is confirmed by a number of different sources, a number of different accounts, like Kingsley's ancient chronologies, as well, that suggest it was at that time that a major terrestrial upheaval occurred, which was identified, for instance, in Babylonian accounts with the first great flood, the first deluge, which caused the downfall of the first Atlantean empire and triggered a new age or a new time period in the history of the world, which was the Second Atlantean Empire.
Which there was foreknowledge of. Again, these beings had foreknowledge. They had the capacities for even telepathy and for precognizance and so forth. So there were those who left, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
They left and they took that knowledge with them. So not all was lost just because the landmass went down. So let's talk about what happened when that went down, the beings.
Yeah, absolutely. So according to the esoteric tradition, two different factions developed on Atlantis. One that was still attached to the original spiritual roots of these early Atlanteans, and another one that was much more materialistic, was rapidly degenerating. So a war ensued between these two factions, which is what triggered the first mass migrations outside of Atlantis. It was in part caused by geological upheavals, so the first major sinking of landmass in the mid-Atlantic Ocean, but was also triggered by this intense warfare between these two different factions.
What was that warfare like from the Vedas and other documents you've been able to discern?
Well, there is the suggestion that these warfare involved the use of devastating weapons, what we would call today weapons of mass destruction, in a way. And so it was quite possibly as a consequence of this war that the first major sinking of Atlantis occurred.
Such as an atomic explosion of sorts, with some other technology.
Of sorts.
Right.
And there are some suggestions, you mentioned the Vedas, for instance, in the ancient Hindu text, that it was in fact the case, that weapons of mass destruction were employed by these different factions that through some sort of technological imbalance in a way that we do not necessarily understand, that actually triggered the first major sinking of Atlantis.
So according to what you've been able to discern, roughly around 35,000 years ago, then culture started reseeding itself. Now, let me look through this. You call it something like this great vast period, I think after the second destruction, was it? Long period of time where there's nothing.
Yeah.
Can't find anything. Now, timing, timing is always the most difficult part of all of these things. So what happened then at that 35,000 year mark after the top part broke off and sunk? Now you have the middle Atlantean period, which still had very sophisticated technology and beautiful technology. So let's talk about how that was receded.
Yeah, so that's a time period that lasted for over 20,000 years. And it is, as you say, immediately after the first Atlantean cataclysm, there was sort of a hiatus in a way in which we do not have many records. So it's as if Atlantean civilization receded or almost went back to a stage of much lesser development and sophistication. But it's also a time in which Atlantean civilization spread to other parts of the world.
Yes.
There is evidence around that time a second center of civilization developed in Central Asia, in the region of the Gobi Desert in particular. That was in a way antagonistic to the original Atlantic or mid-Atlantic center of Atlantean civilization. And so you have these two same factions that were responsible for the first downfall of Atlantis around 35,000 BC that continued in a way this struggle, this warfare, but from two different centers. So on the one hand, you still had an Atlantic center located on what was left of the Atlantean landmass in the mid-Atlantic Ocean, but then you also had a new center of civilization established in Central Asia. And that these two cultures, which, by the way, this Asian center was what in the theosophical doctrine was called the center of Aryan humanity.
Aryan, yes.
The fifth
India,
world race.
out of India, yes. And
correct.
Yes.
Correct. And so you have to imagine, you have to picture this struggle between the remnants of Atlantis, which in time were also able to reestablish a new Atlantean civilization, what they call the Second Atlantean Empire.
Yes.
And this new Aryan humanity that detached itself from the main body of Atlantean humanity to give rise to a wholly new civilization in Central Asia.
Edgar Cayce had said that there would come a time in the near future where Atlantis would rise again. And it seemed like he was speaking quite literally. We still have in the Azores, Mount Picos, for example, little tiny remnants of Atlantis that exist, but said that it would be rising again. What do you take that to mean?
Well, I think that that time is now. Now, I don't know if we have necessarily to take it literally. I think when it's to think about
Is it the knowledge, the spirit?
Right,
Yeah.
right. That's the way I see it. I see it much more as a renaissance of Atlantean knowledge, of Atlantean spirituality in a way that is going to be triggered by rediscovery of the Atlantean past, very much in the same way as during the 15th, the 16th century, a rediscovered the classical civilization of Greece and Rome was what triggered the Renaissance, this incredible surge of human culture and civilization. I do think we're at the edge of a very similar rediscovery, that the rediscovery of the Atlantean past is going to really bring forth a new golden age for mankind.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. You have a very elegant mind. I'm very, very pleased to be sitting here with you because you're not just turning over stones. You're also esoterically curious and courageous. And you've put this all together in your book, and you've taken it even further in terms of conversation with me, and I'm very happy to have been part of it because you had such clarity and elegance of thought to all of these themes we're so interested in. Thank you, Marco.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Again, the name of Marco's book is Empires of Atlantis, which you can find through major booksellers. You can also visit his site at marcovigato.com. Until next time, thank you for joining us here on Open Minds.
Common people around the world are doing the uncommon.
I mean, it is literally the Netflix of spirituality.